Last semester, you learned about the nervous system and how that's a form of communication with body parts. Now we're going to look at a second one, the endocrine system. So you need to be able to have communication between So you have two methods of communicating between body parts. Nervous system, which you learned last semester. This is where you have an action potential in a neuron. And you then secrete neurotransmitter onto the effector. So here is your neuron. This arrow represents the action potential moving through the neuron. Here are the cells that are your effectors. They're the cells you're telling to do something. And here you can see you are secreting neurotransmitter. So this is an up close of right here. Those synaptic knobs at the end of the axon secrete neurotransmitter. Then recall that neurotransmitter binds to effectors, binds to receptors on your effectors. And that is how you stimulate your body parts to do something. So then we have a similar situation with hormones. So endocrine is when you use hormones to do this. So an endocrine, a gland, secretes a hormone into the blood. And the hormone will bind to receptors on its effector. So here on this side, you can see here's the hormone in the blood. These cells are the effector, and you can see that the hormone is leaving the blood and it's binding to receptors on those cells. So this is where endocrine and nervous are similar. They both have a chemical that binds to receptors on the effector, and this is called a ligand. So you may remember in chapter 12 we talked about ligand regulated gates. So a ligand is a chemical that binds to a receptor. So hormones and neurotransmitters are your two types of ligands. Now let's look at differences between endocrine and nervous. Nervous is very fast. We're talking a fraction of a second. It's also very precise. The neuron goes to the effector cells. So only the effector receives the neurotransmitter. Endocrine is slower because you travel in the blood. So you're relying on the blood to deliver the hormone. So it can take a few minutes for the blood to get the hormone to its destination. It also is widespread. Since the hormone is in the blood, all the parts of the body are exposed to the hormone. So the way you target specific cells is with the receptors. Only cells with the receptor for that hormone will respond to it. So any cell that does not have a receptor for that particular hormone is just going to ignore the hormone, even though it's being exposed to it. It also has long-lasting effects. So a nerve signal only lasts for a fraction of a second, but hormones will continue to stimulate their effectors for minutes or several hours or even a couple of days. Now let's look at types of hormones. You have 3 main types of hormones in the body. The first type of hormone is steroid. Steroid hormones are made from cholesterol. So you eat cholesterol, it's part of your food. Some of the cholesterol that you eat gets converted into your steroid hormones. And cholesterol, remember, is a lipid. So these steroid hormones are also a lipid. And lipids are hydrophobic. So they don't like to mix with water. A few examples of steroid hormones are the sex hormones. So estrogen and testosterone. Estrogen is in women, testosterone is in men. This is a picture of the adrenal gland. The outer part is the adrenal cortex. In chapter 15, you learned about the adrenal medulla. That's the inner part. The adrenal cortex secretes over 20 hormones. And they are steroids. An example of one that you'll learn about in this class is aldosterone. Then another example is vitamin D. You probably remember this from chapter 6. When you eat cholesterol, that cholesterol goes to your skin where keratinocytes convert it to vitamin D when you sit out in the sun. So vitamin D is both a vitamin and a hormone. It is considered a hormone because your cells are making it and putting it into your blood. Our next main type of hormone is the biogenic amines. These are also sometimes called monoamine. Okay, look at the word here. Break the word down. You have amine. That is for amino acid. And if you look at the monoamine name, mono means one. So this is one amino acid. So biogenic amines are a modified amino acid. So you get these hormones because you eat protein. And whenever you eat protein, you digest it into amino acids. And then you modify some of these amino acids to become your biogenic amine hormones. A couple examples of biogenic amines would be thyroid hormone. And this comes from your thyroid gland. And look at this, these people are skydiving. They're having an adrenaline rush. Epinephrine. You remember from chapter 15, learning all about norepinephrine? That is also a biogenic amine. Our third one is the protein hormones. They can also be called peptide. These are also made of amino acids, but the difference is that it's several of them. So again, with the biogenic amines, you eat protein, you digest it into amino acids, and in this case, instead of just using one, you're taking several and stringing them together. And an example of a peptide hormone is insulin from your pancreas. Another way to classify hormones is if they're water-soluble or lipid-soluble. Water-soluble hormones are all of the protein hormones and the biogenic amines, with the exception of thyroid hormone. So thyroid hormone is a biogenic amine, but it is not water-soluble. So being water-soluble means that they will mix with water. Or in other words, they're hydrophilic. This is important because hormones travel in the blood, and blood is mostly made of water. So with your water-soluble hormones, they have no trouble traveling in the blood. They travel in the blood just fine. Then when they get to the cells, they're going to bind to a receptor on the surface of the cell. So in this picture, this is the outside of the cell. This is the inside of the cell. This blue thing here is the receptor. And here, this green triangle is the hormone. So water-soluble hormones will bind to a receptor on the surface of the cell. They're going to cause a change inside the cell, though. So you have to have what's called a second messenger. This purple thing here is a second messenger. Notice how it's attached to the receptor. So when the hormone binds to the receptor, this activates the second messenger. That second messenger will then go do one of two things. So in the top picture here, it shows that the second messenger, so just to show you what's in here, here's the hormone. Here's the receptor. Then you activate the second messenger. So these arrows show the second messenger being activated. Here you have an enzyme. The enzyme is inactive, or the enzyme is active. The second messenger activates the enzyme. So a second messenger can then activate an enzyme. The bottom picture shows the other thing a second messenger can do. Here is a gate. Think back to chapter 4. Gates let ions in and out of cells. So you can see here extracellular fluid, that's the outside of the cell. Cytosol, that's the inside of the cell. Here's your hormone, here's your receptor, here's your second messenger. When the hormone binds, it activates the second messenger, and then the second messenger goes and opens the gate to let ions in or out. So the other thing a second messenger can do is to open a gate, and you let ions in or out. So to summarize a water-soluble hormone, it will travel in the blood just fine. So it does not need a carrier because it mixes with the water in the blood. It then binds to a receptor on the surface. This activates a second messenger. And then two things can possibly happen from that second messenger. You can activate an enzyme, or you can open a gate. Now we'll look at lipid-soluble hormones. Lipid-soluble are the steroid hormones, because remember they are made from cholesterol, and cholesterol is a lipid. And thyroid hormone. Thyroid hormone is a biogenic amine, but it's lipid-soluble. So it's the exception to the rule. So lipids, steroids, are going to be hydrophobic. So this presents a challenge for hormones since they travel in the blood, and blood is mostly water. So they need a carrier in the blood. So in this picture, here is the hormone, the yellow thing, and the blue thing here is the carrier. So the first issue to consider with lipid-soluble hormones is how they travel in the blood. Since they are hydrophobic, they must be bound to a carrier. So while a hormone is bound to a carrier, it is called bound hormone. The carrier is essentially protecting it from touching the water in the blood. At any given time, 90 to 99% of the hormone is bound. So while it's bound, it is protected. But it can't interact with target cells. In order to interact with the target cell, it has to become unbound. So an unbound hormone is released from its carrier. So here you can see it's unbound. This hormone has been released from its carrier, and now it goes to interact with the target cell. So this is our target cell. So at any given time, this is going to be 1 to 10% of the hormone. So the implication of this is that lipid-soluble hormones are basically a slow release. When a gland secretes a lipid-soluble hormone, you get a bunch of hormone into the blood, but most of it is bound. So you get a large amount into the blood, but most is bound. And you slowly, over the course of hours or days, that hormone becomes unbound and interacts with target cells. And it's not all at once, it's only 1 to 10% at a time becomes unbound. So a main difference between lipid-soluble and water-soluble hormones is how long they last. Lipid-soluble will be active for days or hours. And that's because of how it's bound to these carriers. Back up here, the water-soluble, because it does not require a carrier, it's only active for a few minutes. Then let's look at how this hormone interacts with the cell. So remember from back in chapter 4, your cell membrane is lipid. It's all those phospholipids. This hormone is lipid soluble. So you can see here, it passes through the cell membrane, and here is its receptor inside the cell. So lipid-soluble hormone will enter the target cell, and it binds with a receptor inside the cell. This is then called a hormone receptor complex. So this, where the hormone and receptor are bound to each other, is a hormone receptor complex. The purple part here is the nucleus of the cell. So again, think back to chapter 4, the parts you've learned. The hormone receptor complex enters the nucleus. Now think about what's inside a nucleus. Hopefully you remember DNA. The hormone receptor complex binds to DNA. Now if you also think back to chapter 4, DNA codes for protein. And when you go to make a protein, you first have to make messenger RNA, which is a copy of the gene. it then goes out to the ribosome, and it follows those instructions, and you make a protein. So that hormone receptor complex will enter the nucleus. It will bind to the DNA. This stimulates the DNA to transcribe into messenger RNA. The messenger RNA will then go to the ribosome, and the ribosome will translate it into protein. So you end up building a protein. So to summarize, a lipid-soluble hormone results in the cell making a protein. So whenever you have a lipid-soluble hormone, your cell is going to respond by building protein, doing protein synthesis. Now we're going to look at some more of the interaction between hormones and their target cells. So here is a target cell, and it's the same in both pictures. So here's another target cell. The blue Y-shaped things are the receptors, and all these green triangles are the hormone. So we know that hormone binds to receptors, on the target cell, and that is what stimulates the cell. So you can have different amounts of hormone and different amounts of receptor. So on the left here, we have a low hormone level. When blood hormone level is low, that will cause the cell to upregulate. So it's the low hormone level that causes the upregulation. So this means that the cell will have lots of receptors. So as you can see here in this picture, this cell has lots of receptors. It needs lots of receptors so that it has a better chance of catching what little hormone there is available. So low blood hormone level stimulates cells to have more receptors. The opposite of this is downregulation. So here we have a high blood hormone level. Too much hormone overstimulates a cell. And cells do not like this overstimulation. So this will cause the cell to downregulate. Which means it will get rid of some receptors. So it loses receptors. This way the cell can't be overstimulated by too much hormone binding to it. So it's the cell's way of protecting itself from being overstimulated by high hormone level. Another way to think of this is like the volume. So if I whisper, you can't hear very well. You're probably leaning in close to your computer, maybe turning the volume up. That's upregulating. The volume is low, so you have to tune in and try to catch what little volume there is. If I yell, then you downregulate. You probably moved back away from your computer a little bit, and you turn the volume down because you don't want to be overstimulated by the high volume. An example of up and down regulation comes in with type 2 diabetes mellitus. In this condition, you start with high blood sugar, which glucose is the name for blood sugar. So you have high blood glucose. This can be due to poor diet and lack of exercise. So if you're eating too many carbohydrates, you're putting too much glucose into your blood, and exercise could burn that glucose off, but if you're not exercising, you're not burning it off. So you just get all this glucose building up in the blood. Whenever you get glucose in your blood, your pancreas secretes insulin. So insulin is the hormone. Insulin binds to receptors on the cell. So if you look at this top picture here, there's the insulin. You can see it binds to the receptor, and that stimulates the cells to take up glucose. So when insulin binds to the receptor, that gate opens and glucose goes into the cell. So remember, this is insulin is a protein hormone which is water soluble. So it's binding to a receptor on the surface of the cell, and you're opening a gate to let something into the cell, characteristic of water soluble hormones. So when your blood glucose is high, your pancreas secretes even more insulin. So the more glucose you have in your blood, the more insulin your pancreas secretes. So if your glucose is really high, your insulin will be really high. And this high insulin makes your cells downregulate. So you will actually get fewer insulin receptors. So here in the bottom picture, you can see these insulin receptors are not functioning. You're down to only 2 functioning insulin receptors in the insulin-resistant cell with the type 2 diabetes mellitus. And then this gets into this positive feedback cycle. So think back to chapter 1 when you learned about negative and positive feedback. Positive feedback doesn't mean that it's a good thing. It just means that the cycle keeps repeating itself and intensifying. So then because the cell doesn't take up glucose, it builds up in the blood, which then means you get more insulin, which then means your cell downregulates even more, and this cycle continues. So you keep getting higher glucose, which leads to higher insulin, which leads to more downregulation. And if your cells don't take glucose out of the blood, it builds up to higher levels. So your cells don't respond to the insulin. So this is that whole insulin insensitivity. And then this higher level of glucose means even more insulin, which then means more downregulation, and it just keeps going. Take a minute and think back all the way to Chapter 1. You learned about homeostasis. This means maintaining your internal body conditions. One of the things you have to maintain homeostasis of is your blood nutrients. You have to keep the same level of nutrients in your blood all the time, regardless of whether you're eating or it's been several hours since you've eaten or how active you are. And hormones are very important in doing this. So in this video, we're going to see the basics of how hormones can maintain your blood nutrient levels. So first, let's look at your nutrients. We have here carbohydrates. And when you eat carbohydrates and you digest them, you get glucose. So glucose is what's in your blood. This column represents what's in your blood. This column represents what you eat. When you eat carbohydrates, you get glucose in your blood. The next one, this food group, represents proteins. Right? Meats, eggs, cheese, so on. Those are all good sources of protein. When you eat protein, you get amino acids. So your digestive system breaks protein down into amino acids. The last picture here is my favorite, a peanut butter parfait, all full of fat. And when you eat different types of fat, you get triglycerides in your blood. So when we talk about blood nutrients, we are talking about three things: glucose, amino acids, and triglycerides. Let's think about eating. Let's suppose you go have a bacon, egg, and cheese croissant for breakfast before you come to class. That breakfast will have 530 calories in it. You get all those calories at once. It only takes a few minutes to eat one of these sandwiches. So you now have lots of blood nutrients. Then you come to class. Sitting in class burns about 100 calories an hour. You have 530 you just ate. So you're going to use some of those nutrients, but not all. So you are going to have extra nutrients in your blood that you don't need right now. Your body does not like to be wasteful. Suppose you got a paycheck and your paycheck was $530 and you went to Walmart and you bought your toothpaste and toilet paper and some food and whatever you need for the week, and it came out to $100. So now you have an extra $430 you don't need right now. Are you just going to throw that money in the trash can on your way out of the store? Of course not. That would be crazy. Your body uses that same logic. Your body is not going to let those extra 430 calories just go to waste. It's going to save them. Just like after your trip to Walmart, you put that $430 in your wallet because you know you're going to need to buy more stuff next week. Your body does the same thing. First, we'll look at the amino acids. So here are those amino acids that are in your blood. Your body is going to do protein anabolism. And make those amino acids into proteins. So your amino acids are built into proteins. This is not a storage. This is just they become part of your body. So they might become collagen in your bones and skin, or they might become enzymes that you're going to use. When it comes to glucose and lipids, those are the ones you store. So the piggy bank here represents storage. You store your glucose and your lipids. Glucose gets stored in your liver and your skeletal muscles. So think of liver and skeletal muscles as like a wallet that you put your extra glucose in. And when you store glucose, you store it as glycogen. So glucose is an individual little molecule. You can see here there's a glucose. Glycogen is just several glucose all linked together. Then your triglycerides you're going to store in your adipose. And remember back in chapter 5, learning all the tissues, adipose just means your fat tissue. So your triglycerides get stored in your adipose or your fat. Then later, between meals, when you need nutrients, you're going to pull these back out of storage. So you can take the glucose and the lipids back out of storage and use them. So just like you put that $430 in your wallet, next week you have to go buy more stuff, but maybe you only get paid once a month. You've got that money in your wallet that you can use because you saved it. Down here is your liver and your kidney, and this is for a special process that they can do. If your blood glucose is getting low, say you're not eating enough carbohydrates and there's just a lack of glucose. So you're not eating enough carbohydrates and there's not glycogen to draw on to get the storage back out, and there's not enough glucose in your blood. You must maintain glucose because your neurons need it. Other cells in your body can get by on fat and amino acids and other things for making ATP, but your neurons can't. And your neurons, remember, are what make up your brain, your spine, and your nerves. They can only use glucose to make ATP. So you have to somehow get some glucose into your blood if you're not eating carbohydrates. Your liver and kidney can do a process called gluconeogenesis. This is where they can convert non-carbohydrate molecules to glucose. So, such as amino acids. If somebody is in like a starvation situation, their body will start to break down their own muscles in order to release the amino acids from the protein in the muscles, and then the liver and kidney will convert those to glucose so that you can have glucose to keep your brain running. Okay. This picture is just taking all those ideas now and putting them to the scientific language. So we have here glucose. So you can see when you have extra glucose in the blood, so when you have extra in your blood, you will move it to storage in your liver and skeletal muscles. And this process is glycogenesis. So here you can see number one, there's glycogenesis. And if you break down what these words mean, you have glyco for glycogen. And then genesis means formation. So this just means formation of glycogen because you're going to store the glucose as glycogen. Then between meals, when you need to get that glucose back out of storage, then you will do this process, glycogenolysis. Lysis means break. And then again, there you have glycogen. So this just means you break glycogen, and when you break glycogen, you get glucose back. Then we have that gluconeogenesis. So this is if you are desperate for glucose. Then your kidneys and your liver can do the gluconeogenesis. So genesis, remember, is formation. Neo means new, and the gluco for glucose. So this means you're going to make new glucose. And it's new glucose because it wasn't a carbohydrate. It was most likely an amino acid that has been turned into the carbohydrate glucose. Then here we have our lipids. So we have two processes here. Lipogenesis. So break it down. Genesis is formation. So this is when you store your extra lipid. Then you have lipolysis. So remember, lysis is break. And both of these start with lipo for lipid. So this is when you return it to the blood. And that is going in and out of your adipose tissue. Then finally, we have the protein. Whenever you have plenty of amino acids in your blood, you do protein anabolism. So this is where you will build amino acids into protein. And this happens in all cells of your body, and especially in your muscles. So that's why here they're showing just cells in general, because every cell is going to do this, but then they also have a muscle because your muscles do a lot of this. Then you have protein catabolism. This is something your body prefers to avoid. You don't like breaking down your proteins. So if you can avoid it, you will. But sometimes it's necessary. So this is when you break your proteins to release amino acids. Think of protein catabolism. Think of like if you needed some 2x4s. You had some project and you really needed some 2x4s and you didn't have any, so you tore down a wall in your house in order to get the 2x4s out. That's what protein catabolism is like. So these processes, all the storing and releasing of the 3 nutrients are all controlled by hormones. And there's many hormones that can influence these processes. So later in the chapter, once we start getting into specific hormones, you'll see that we list as a function of the hormone, perhaps glycogenolysis or lipolysis or lipogenesis. So many hormones all contribute to controlling these processes of moving nutrients back and forth between your blood and your tissues. If you haven't seen The Office, you're missing out. It's a hilarious show. In The Office, you have Michael. He is the boss. So he makes decisions. And everyone else has to do what Michael says. Then you have Dwight. Dwight is hilarious. He is the best character. Dwight is the assistant to the regional manager. So when Michael makes decisions and gives commands, he tells Dwight. Dwight then makes sure that everyone else in the office follows Michael's commands. So he passes on Michael's commands to everyone else in the office. And then you have Jim. Jim is one of the workers in the office. And he is often the target of Dwight's enthusiastic enforcing of Michael's commands. Some of your endocrine system is set up like the office. You have your hypothalamus. This is the part of your brain that makes decisions. And it gives commands. It communicates those commands to the pituitary gland. And then the pituitary gland tells other parts of the body about those commands and tells them to do them. So you have a chain of command. The hypothalamus is in charge. It makes decisions. It gives commands. It communicates those commands to the pituitary gland. The pituitary gland then tells other parts of the body, hey, this is what you're supposed to be doing. So here's an up close of the pituitary. And the pituitary is divided into 2 parts. We have the anterior pituitary in the front. And you have the posterior pituitary in the back. The anterior pituitary makes and secretes 6 hormones. The posterior pituitary stores and secretes two hormones. These hormones are made by the hypothalamus. So the hypothalamus makes them, then it sends them to the posterior pituitary and it says, here, hold these until I tell you to secrete them. So both of these are under the control of the hypothalamus. So we'll look at the hormones. So first, the anterior pituitary. We have 6 anterior pituitary hormones. The first one is thyroid stimulating hormone, and a lot of these hormones have abbreviations. So we can just call it TSH, as thyroid stimulating hormone. And its name says exactly what it does. It stimulates the thyroid gland. So this is a picture of the thyroid gland. It's kind of this butter-shaped gland that's in your neck, and it will secrete thyroid hormone, which is TH. Next, we have prolactin. Okay, think about root words here. Lactin, lactation. Prolactin stimulates the mammary glands to produce milk. So this would be in new mothers. Then we have FSH and LH, follicle stimulating hormone and luteinizing hormone. They're kind of lumped here together. This is a testy, and this is an ovary. Testis is singular. FSH and LH stimulate them for reproduction. And we're not going to get into a lot of the details, but basically they're stimulating them to make hormones and gametes. For now, we can just put reproduction. And we'll get into the details of that in chapter 29. Then we have growth hormone, which we can abbreviate GH. Again, they gave us a simple one here. Growth hormone makes you grow. And then the last one is adrenocorticotropic hormone. Here's where we're glad for abbreviations. We can put ACTH. This stimulates the adrenal cortex. Okay, we learned about the adrenal gland back in chapter 15. That was the adrenal medulla. So just to clarify here, the inside part here is the adrenal medulla. This is the one that gives you an adrenaline rush. So that's part of the autonomic nervous system. The adrenal cortex is the one we're talking about now. It's the outer part. Although structurally they are together, functionally they are completely separate. So when we're talking about the adrenal cortex, that has nothing to do with sympathetic or fight or flight or adrenaline or anything like that. The adrenal cortex is a completely separate thing from the adrenal medulla that we talked about in chapter 15. So the adrenal cortex has several hormones that it will secrete. And we're not going to cover all of them, but we will look at one of them, aldosterone, later on, and cortisol. Then if we look at the posterior pituitary. So the posterior pituitary, back here, has 2 hormones that it secretes. And remember, they're made by the hypothalamus and then stored and secreted by the posterior pituitary. First one is ADH, which is antidiuretic hormone. It tells the kidney to make less urine. This would be in order to conserve water in your blood. If you're sweating or you haven't had a drink in a while and you need to conserve water in your blood, that's when you get spikes in ADH. The other one is oxytocin. The main function of this hormone is to cause the uterine contractions during labor. So a woman who's about to have a baby has lots of oxytocin. It is also used after the birth for milk ejection. So prolactin stimulates the mammary glands to make milk. Oxytocin stimulates the release of the milk. Not all of your hormones are under control of the hypothalamus, but here you can see you have 8 hormones that come from this hypothalamus pituitary chain of command. Now that you know the general stuff about the endocrine system, we can start looking at individual hormones. The first one we're going to look at is cortisol. This is known as the stress hormone. It works hand in hand with your fight or flight response. Both of these are responses that help you to deal with stress. Now remember, biologically, your body is adapted to a different kind of stress than what we experience today. So you have to think about the stress that humans evolved to deal with. That would be something like a lion chasing you. It's not the stress of like homework and deadlines and your boss and stuff like that. So we are adapted to short-term stress. So your body is adapted to stress that lasts for just a few minutes. If a lion is chasing you, that's stress. After a couple of minutes, you have either gotten away and you're safe, or the lion caught you and you're dead. Either way, the stress is over. When you have this immediate response to stress, you need energy. So you need your cells to make lots of ATP, because you have to run away from this lion, or maybe you're going to turn around and fight the lion. Either way, you need lots of ATP. So to make lots of ATP, you need lots of blood nutrients. So this is where those processes we talked about before are going to come into play. We want to get more glucose into the blood. We are going to get that from the liver. So the liver is going to break down the stored glucose that it has. We're also going to do gluconeogenesis because we want to make sure we have plenty of glucose. Now remember, gluconeogenesis is when you convert other molecules to glucose. So in this case, we are going to have your cells do protein catabolism. So they are going to break down their proteins to release amino acids into the blood. And this then supplies the amino acids for the gluconeogenesis, and those amino acids get converted to more glucose in the blood. We are also going to put lipid in the blood. You need lots of triglycerides there. So we're going to do lipolysis in your adipose tissue. So these things, you raise your blood nutrients. so that your cells have the fuel to make ATP. And then you have the energy to deal with the stress. So, like I said, this is best in short term. Today we experience stress very differently. Our modern lives, we have long-term stress. You might be stressed out all day or all week even. And that doesn't work as well then. You start to get the negative effects. So when you have this long-term ongoing stress, you can get suppressed immune system. So you're more likely to get sick and to get cancer. You can get retention of sodium and water. So you get bloating. And it can inhibit the repair of connective tissue. So an injury might take a long time to heal. Now there is one good effect of this though that we actually utilize, and that is decreased inflammation. Inflammation is part of your immune response. So inflammation is kind of a branch of the immune system. And since long-term stress does inhibit the immune system, it also decreases inflammation. And we take advantage of this in medicine. So cortisone, like if you get this cream, or sometimes people will get cortisone shots into their joints if they have a lot of inflammation, like in their knee or their shoulder, they'll get a cortisone shot. That will actually decrease the inflammation. So when you're putting this on your poison ivy or your bug bites, you're mimicking that cortisol that you naturally have. Our next two hormones that we're going to look at are insulin and glucagon. These hormones maintain homeostasis of your blood nutrients. So we're going to start off with the scenario that you eat. Every time you eat, you have a rise in your blood nutrients. So recall from our earlier chapter about nutrients, that means you're going to have glucose in the blood, because when you eat carbohydrates, you digest them into glucose. You're going to have lipids in your blood, and your proteins get digested to amino acid. So whenever you eat, all three, glucose, lipids, and amino acids, go up. So you have higher levels of those in your blood. Your pancreas detects the rise in glucose. So all three go up, but glucose is the one that your pancreas is monitoring. When it detects this rise in glucose, it secretes insulin. So insulin is secreted in response to a rise in glucose. The job of insulin is to lower your blood nutrients. So you eat, blood nutrients go up, your pancreas secretes insulin. Homeostasis means you want to stay at a steady level. So since nutrients are high, you want to bring them back down. So the job of insulin is to move nutrients out of the blood. So this is your storage hormone. This is the one that's going to tell you to save those extra nutrients for later. So with glucose, think about this, you pretty much already know. Glucose is stored as glycogen in your liver and your skeletal muscles, and that is going to be glycogenesis. So your liver and your skeletal muscles will both do glycogenesis in response to insulin. On the end here, those are just general cells. They will also take up glucose, but they're not going to store it as glycogen. They're going to use it to make ATP. So all the cells in your body in response to insulin are going to take up glucose, use it to make ATP. Extra glucose is going to be stored as glycogen in your liver and your muscles. Then with the lipids, extra lipids are stored in your adipose. So here's adipose tissue. You're going to do lipogenesis to store the extra lipids. Amino acids, remember, are not stored. They are built into proteins. So the amino acids are going to go into all cells and into muscles especially. And you're going to do protein anabolism. So that the amino acids are built into proteins of your body. So as a result of this, your blood nutrient levels go down. So you're moving nutrients out of the blood and into your tissues. Remember, nothing goes to waste. You're not getting rid of the nutrients, you're just putting them in your tissues. Then next, we go to glucagon. This one comes up between meals. So between meals, there's no nutrients entering your blood. So this causes your blood nutrients to fall because your cells are constantly using nutrients. So as your cells constantly use them, the amount in the blood starts to drop. Your pancreas, again, is going to respond. Your pancreas detects the drop in glucose. So even though all of your nutrients are dropping, glucose is the one your pancreas detects and responds to. This time, the pancreas secretes glucagon. So the job of glucagon is to bring your nutrients back up to homeostasis. So glucagon will increase blood nutrients by removing them from storage and putting them back into your blood. So we're going to get glucose from the liver. So from the liver, we will put glucose back in the blood. That means you're going to break the glycogen, which is glycogenolysis. Remember, lysis means to break. And from the adipose, we're going to get that lipid back into the blood, your triglycerides. And we do that through lipolysis. So notice that glucagon does not reverse everything insulin did. It only reversed two things insulin did. Right, so you do put glucose from the liver back into the blood and lipids from the adipose. So let's take a look at the things it does not reverse. So if you compare these, remember you had glucose also stored in the muscles. It does not take glucose from the muscles. That is because the muscles use that glucose themselves. Whatever glucose you store in the muscles will use. They don't put it back in the blood. We also don't get glucose back from cells. Remember with insulin, insulin causes cells to use the glucose to make ATP. So the cells have already used it. They can't give it back. They don't have it anymore. It's like giving somebody $10 and they run out and spend it right away. Then you ask for your $10 back. They don't have it. They spent it. So they already used it. And if you recall from chapter 3, that glucose is now carbon dioxide and water. It's not even glucose anymore. You also don't get your amino acids back. So remember, amino acids are not stored. They're built into your proteins. So they are now proteins of your body. And although protein catabolism is possible, where you can break your proteins down and put the amino acids back in your blood, you don't like to do that. So insulin and glucagon are opposite of each other. They are antagonistic hormones. And between them, they keep a balance of your blood nutrient levels. So insulin and glucagon are antagonistic. This means they have opposite effects. But they work together to maintain homeostasis. So you can see here is homeostasis. Normal blood glucose level about 90 to 100. That number varies depending on what book you're reading, but in general, 100 give or take. Whenever blood glucose rises, so here is rising blood glucose, your pancreas detects that and it secretes insulin. Insulin acts to bring the glucose back down. Whenever your glucose is low, your pancreas again detects that. It secretes glucagon. Glucagon acts to raise your glucose back up. So between these two hormones, you stay here at this homeostasis level. Insulin and glucagon work to maintain blood nutrients. Let's look at diabetes mellitus and see what's happening here. So here is the pancreas, and here is a cell. So if we look at this situation, the healthy situation. In a healthy situation, you get rising blood glucose. In response to that, the pancreas secretes insulin. The insulin binds to receptors on the cells. And the cells take up the glucose. So here you can see the glucose goes into the cell. And as a result of taking up the glucose, the blood glucose level goes down. And because it goes down now, you are in homeostasis. So this is what happens every time you eat. The next two pictures show what can go wrong with this system. So we have type 1 diabetes mellitus and type 2 diabetes mellitus. So let's look at the type 1 diabetes mellitus. In this case, the pancreas fails to produce insulin. So this is when you get an infection of the pancreas. By a virus. Your immune system goes to kill the virus, but it messes up and destroys parts of your pancreas instead. And you're left unable to produce insulin. So then, when you have rising blood glucose, there's no insulin to secrete to bind to the receptors. So here you can see the empty receptor. So because there's no insulin, blood glucose goes up, but without the insulin, the cells don't take the glucose. So notice the glucose just remains in the blood. So then you get very high blood glucose levels in the hundreds because it just builds up in the blood. So what ends up happening is the kidneys filter this glucose out when they make urine. So then that glucose is lost in the urine. So this is why diabetes causes glucose in the urine. Also, because you have that glucose in the urine, you get excess urine. So people with diabetes go to the bathroom a lot. Glucose has osmotic pressure. It attracts water. So all that glucose in the urine attracts more water into the urine. And the actual name here, diabetes, if you look at diabetes mellitus, what this actually means, diabetes is excess urine. And that's because the glucose is osmotic and attracts water. And mellitus means honey. The urine of a diabetic tastes sweet like honey. And in the old days, before modern technology, doctors would diagnose diabetes by tasting their patient's urine. Now, it's not that they would like drink a whole cup full of it, but they would dip their finger in the urine and then touch their finger to their tongue to see if it tasted sweet. So be thankful you live today when we have just those little glucose test strips you can dip into urine. Another thing that you often see with type 1 diabetes is weight loss. This is because since your cells can't use glucose, they can't take it up without insulin. Now this is except your neurons. Neurons are the only cells that can take up glucose without insulin. So if you don't have insulin, your neurons will still get glucose, but none of your other cells can use glucose. So that means they have to use fat instead. And that's why you get weight loss. Your cells are forced to use fat to make ATP instead of using glucose. This also explains the acidosis. If you're familiar with diabetes, you know that it can cause ketoacidosis. This occurs because the cells are using fat to make ATP. You get ketoacids. So with type 1 diabetes, you get sugar in the urine. That's because their cells can't take up the glucose. It builds up in the blood, and then the kidneys filter it out. You get excess urine because the glucose is osmotic. It's pulling more water into the urine with it. You get weight loss because since cells can't use glucose, they use fats instead. And you get ketoacidosis because all that burning of fat produces acids that are dumped into the blood. You also have thirst. Frequent thirst is a sign of diabetes. That's because you're dehydrated from all the water being lost in the urine. So diabetics will drink a lot and urinate a lot. But the cause and effect, it's the urinating a lot that causes them to drink a lot. So you can't just say, well, quit drinking so much and then you'll quit peeing so much. It's the other way around. The diabetes is making them urinate so much, and all that urination is causing them to become dehydrated, and the dehydration makes you feel thirsty. So that is type 1 diabetes. And the only treatment for this is insulin shots. Now again, today we're lucky we have treatment. You can take insulin. Hundreds of years ago, before there was insulin that you could just inject into people, people who had diabetes would slowly starve to death. And they could eat and eat and eat all day long, and they would still starve to death. Because without insulin, they had no way to get the nutrients from the blood into their tissues. Okay. Our other one is type 2 diabetes. So if we look at this picture, notice the pancreas is still secreting insulin. There's no problem there. The problem is here with the insulin receptor. In type 2 diabetes mellitus, you lack the insulin receptors on the cells. So let's look at what happens here. This is a spiral. It's a positive feedback cycle. And remember back to chapter 1. Positive feedback doesn't mean it's a good thing. It means that it intensifies. It's a cycle that keeps intensifying. Now, there are a lot of factors that go into this. Genetics is very important, but so is lifestyle. So a simplified scenario of what happens with type 2 diabetes. If you have poor diet so that you consume lots of sugar or any kind of carbohydrate, because remember, it all gets converted to glucose. So you consume lots of glucose. And you lack exercise. If you exercise, you burn off that glucose. But if you're not exercising, you're not burning it off. So these two factors will combine to give you high blood glucose. Well, the higher your blood glucose is, the more insulin you need. So this means you will also have high insulin. They go together. The more glucose you have, the more insulin you have. Now think back to earlier when we had talked about receptors upregulating and downregulating. If a hormone level is high, that overstimulates the cell. The cell doesn't like that. And so it downregulates. It reduces the number of receptors it has. So having high insulin causes your cells to downregulate. So this means that they lose some of their insulin receptors. So this means that the cells are not responding to the insulin. There's glucose in the blood, there's insulin in the blood, but the cells aren't responding. And if they fail to respond to insulin, that means they fail to take up glucose from the blood. Well, this means that the blood glucose level climbs even higher. Now the glucose builds up in the blood. So this means you have even higher blood glucose level. Well, if your blood glucose is even higher, that means your insulin is going to be higher. What do you think cells are going to do in response to even higher insulin? They're going to downregulate again. This means they have even fewer insulin receptors. So now they're ignoring the insulin even more, and they're taking up less glucose from the blood. Okay, do you see where this is leading? If they're taking even less glucose from the blood, you're going to have even higher blood glucose. And what happens when you have even higher blood glucose? You get even higher insulin. And then what do cells do as insulin gets higher? They lose more receptors. And this cycle just keeps repeating. Now we're talking about months or years that this cycle repeats, so it's incremental. But the more it repeats, the worse it gets. So when you start off early in this cycle, you can take some oral medications. Some people can even resolve their type 2 diabetes with diet and exercise. The further you get into this cycle, the harder it is to treat. And you can actually get to the point where you become insulin dependent. Because you will work your pancreas to death. Because as you go through the cycle, the pancreas keeps having to work harder and harder for diminishing results. And you can actually work your pancreas to death and then become insulin dependent. So that is type 2 diabetes mellitus. So hopefully now diabetes and why those symptoms of diabetes occur makes sense. Our next hormone is growth hormone. And this one is just like its name suggests. It makes you grow. We're going to look at this in 3 different aspects. First, we're going to look at the hormone itself, how you get it. Then we're going to look at how it makes you grow and how it supplies the energy for growing. So first of all, getting growth hormone. This is controlled by the hypothalamus. So your hypothalamus decides when to secrete growth hormone. It stimulates your anterior pituitary to secrete growth hormone. So getting the hormone involves your hypothalamus stimulating your anterior pituitary to secrete growth hormone. Now, growth hormone has a synergistic partner. Remember back in chapter 7, we talked about PTH and calcitriol are synergistic? Same idea here. Remember, synergistic is when 2 hormones are going to work together. The synergistic partner of growth hormone is insulin-like growth factor, which we can abbreviate as IGF. So this stands for insulin-like growth factor. That comes from the liver. So once you have growth hormone, it goes to the liver and stimulates the liver to secrete IGF. Now you have growth hormone and IGF in the blood. So these are your 2 synergistic hormones. Now they're going to do 2 things. So there's 2 actions of these hormones. One of the actions is to stimulate growth. So we're going to stimulate growth by stimulating the epiphyseal plates of your bones. So remember these from chapter 7? That's that hyaline cartilage toward the ends of the bones where growth occurs. So you're going to stimulate the epiphyseal plates of the bones. You're going to stimulate your muscles. They're going to get bigger and stronger. And you're going to stimulate all cells of the body to do mitosis. So you have 3 ways that you stimulate growth. You stimulate the epiphyseal plates of the bones. You stimulate the muscles to get bigger and stronger, and you stimulate mitosis in other cells of the body. Remember, the more cells you have, the bigger you are. Back in chapter 4, when we talked about cells, we said how like a 10-year-old has more cells than a 1-year-old because a 10-year-old is bigger. All of this growth requires energy. So it takes energy to grow. So the other thing that these hormones do is supply you with that energy. So in order to make energy, you have to have fuel, such as glucose and lipid, so that your cells have something to make ATP. So growth hormone stimulates your liver to do glycogenolysis, and release glucose into your blood, and it stimulates your adipose to do lipolysis and release lipid into your blood. This provides the fuel for cells to make ATP, so they have the energy to grow. So the result of this is you get an increase in blood nutrient levels. This is called the diabetogenic effect. When a hormone is raising blood nutrient levels so that you can make more ATP, that is the diabetogenic effect. So growth hormone is controlled by the hypothalamus. It's released by the anterior pituitary. It stimulates the liver to secrete insulin-like growth factors. So then you have the two hormones working synergistically together. They stimulate growth, the epiphyseal plates of your bones, your muscles, and by telling cells to do mitosis. And they give you the energy to grow by stimulating the liver and the adipose to release stored nutrients, which is the diabetogenic effect. Growth hormone varies. It is definitely not a steady level. So there are four main factors that determine how much growth hormone you have. The first one is age. This is pretty obvious. Kids grow. Adults are done growing. Remember in chapter 7, you learned that the epiphyseal plate closes at the end of puberty and you don't grow anymore. So here you can see it's very high in children and then it drops. Once you get to be an adult, your growth hormone level drops with age. So it is highest in children because children grow. The other factor is time of the day. When kids do grow, they do so at night while they're sleeping. So this is a trick you can use for you parents to get your kids to go to bed, is they have to go to bed in order to grow. I would always tell that to my kids. If you don't go to bed, you won't grow. So growth hormone is highest in the evening. Just before bed, you get a burst of growth hormone. And then you can grow while you're sleeping. Another factor is your blood nutrient levels. This is something else I used to always tell my kids. If you have high glucose, this will reduce your growth hormone. So having lots of soda and candy and all that sugar reduces the amount of growth hormone you have and can kind of stunt your growth. On the other hand, if you have high amino acids, so you're eating lots of protein, that will raise your growth hormone. So eating good healthy foods raises the amount of growth hormone. The fourth one is stress. So this can go either way depending on the stress. If you have stress like in the form of exercise, kind of mild stress, that will increase growth hormone. So again, kids getting out and running around and playing outside, getting some exercise can increase the growth hormone. However, if it's bad stress, like trauma, like a parent dies, or kids who are abused or neglected, who have really bad stress, that will decrease growth hormone and can stunt growth. And you especially see this in abused and neglected kids can have stunted growth. There are other factors too that can cause extremes in the amount of growth hormone. So here you can see we have hyposecretion of growth hormone results in dwarfism. And here is the current shortest person in the world, 2 feet, 5.37 inches. Or you can have hypersecretion of growth hormone, where your pituitary gland secretes way too much, and that results in gigantism. Here is the current tallest person in the world at 8 foot 1 inch. So these are both conditions in which you have extremes in the amount of growth hormone. The world record for the tallest person ever is Robert Wadlow. He is from Alton, Illinois. He lived in the early 1900s, and he had gigantism. So his pituitary gland secreted too much growth hormone, and he grew to be almost 9 feet tall. Not quite, but almost. Here's an interesting little video that tells some more about Robert Wadlow.
Robert Wadlow holds the record for being the tallest person to have ever lived, being an outstanding 8 feet 11.1 inches. Robert was born on February 22nd, 1918 in Alton, Illinois. He weighed a normal 6 pounds 8 ounces when he was born. Nobody assumed anything out of the ordinary. That is, until he reached 6 months and weighed 30 pounds, which is more than double the average weight of a 6-month-old. Throughout his life, Robert would continue to grow at an outstanding rate due to a condition known as hyperplasia, which caused the cells in his body to constantly multiply to keep him growing and growing fast. By his first birthday, Robert was 3 feet 5 inches tall, weighing 45 pounds. At 11 months old, he was already walking. By the age of 5, Robert was taller than his own mother at 5 feet 7 inches. He weighed in at 105 pounds. By the age of 13, Robert was an astonishing 7 feet 4 inches and weighed in at 301 pounds. At the age of 13, he gained the record for being the world's tallest Boy Scout, one he still holds to this day. By the age of 18, Robert was 8 feet 4 inches, weighing in at almost 400 pounds. At the time of his death and only 22 years of age, Robert was standing at a towering 8 feet 11.1 inches, weighing in at 440 pounds. His title has yet to have been beat in over 70 years. If you were to compare him to what is roughly the average height for an Asian elephant, about 8 feet 2 inches, not only is he taller, but he towers over it. With all that said, his tremendous height did not come without complications. He had to endure a lot of physical pain simply walking around. His clothing required 3 times the normal amount of cloth, and he had to have custom-made size 37 shoes. Each pair cost around $100 in the 1930s. That's about $1,700 in today's money. Robert's father even had to make him a specially modified vehicle, just so Robert could fit in it, having him use the whole driver's side of the car. Robert himself always had the dream of becoming a lawyer, and his favorite hobby was film. Sadly, though, he would die at the young age of 22, due to a septic blister that formed on his leg because of a poorly fitted ankle brace, only a week after getting it. When he died on July 15th, 1940, he was so tall that they had to give him 2 plots in the cemetery. He was so tall, in fact, that he still maintains about a 2-inch margin over the second tallest person to ever live, John Rogan, and a 7-inch margin over the current tallest person alive, Swelton Kusen.
So Robert died in 1940 from a septic blister. That was before we had antibiotics. Antibiotics came out in the mid-1940s. Because he was so tall, he had to wear metal braces to help support his legs, and the metal brace made a sore on his leg or on his ankle, and that sore got infected and he died of the infection. Today, if you get a sore from a brace or from your shoe, you just put some antibiotic ointment on it and you're fine. But no antibiotics yet in 1940. Another situation that can happen with growth hormone is acromegaly. This is also an extreme of too much growth hormone. The difference here between this and gigantism is that it occurs as an adult after puberty is over. So remember with Robert, he was tall as a child. So gigantism is when a child has excess growth hormone. Acromegaly is when an adult has excess growth hormone. Think about what you learned in Chapter 7 in the bones. Kids have epiphyseal plates, adults have epiphyseal lines. So Robert grew so tall because this happened as a child when he had an epiphyseal plate, so he was able to grow taller. After puberty, your epiphyseal plates close, so you have an epiphyseal line. So you can't get taller. Instead, the bones get wider. The good news is that we do have medical treatment today. So Robert Wadlow ended up dying young as a kind of a side effect of his condition, but today we do have surgery to. This excess growth hormone tends to be caused by a tumor in the pituitary. And today we have medical treatment for this. So Robert's record still holds, and it will probably continue to hold, because today when kids get this condition, they're able to get treatment for it so that they don't grow to be 9 feet tall and have all the pain and problems that Robert had. Our final hormone is thyroid hormone. And just like with growth hormone, how we covered it as 3 different parts, we're going to do the same with thyroid hormone. So thyroid hormone is another one controlled by the hypothalamus. Your hypothalamus stimulates your anterior pituitary to secrete TSH, which is thyroid stimulating hormone. That stimulates your thyroid gland to secrete TH, thyroid hormone. It does so for a few reasons. One is to maintain homeostasis. You also get more thyroid hormone in response to cold weather and as part of pregnancy. So the main idea of thyroid hormone is it controls your metabolic rate. This is how fast you convert food to energy. So the more thyroid hormone you have, the faster your metabolism. So the level of thyroid hormone does play a role in weight. You may have heard people sometimes talk about gaining weight because of slow thyroid. So the more thyroid hormone you have, the faster your metabolism, the more calories you burn. If you have low thyroid hormone, you will have slow metabolism. And so you won't burn very many calories. And this can cause weight gain. And having high thyroid hormone can cause weight loss. Okay, so thyroid hormone is all about energy, making ATP. So now let's look at the effects, how it does this. Thyroid hormone is going to go to your cells. Remember, cells make ATP, and they use their mitochondria to do so. Mitochondria have enzymes. The more mitochondrial enzymes you have, the more ATP you can make. So thyroid hormone causes your cells to have more mitochondrial enzymes. It also goes to your neurons. Here's a picture of a neuron. If you think back to chapter 12, neurons have sodium-potassium pumps. Those pumps use ATP. Thyroid hormone makes your neurons have more sodium-potassium pumps. So the way thyroid hormone increases metabolism is it causes cells to have more mitochondrial enzymes. So mitochondria is the part of the cell that makes ATP. Enzymes are the workers in there that actually do it. The more enzymes you have, the more work you can do. So this means that cells make more ATP. The second main thing that thyroid hormone does is it stimulates your neurons to have more sodium-potassium pumps. By having more sodium-potassium pumps, your neurons will then use more ATP. So here you are making more ATP and you are using more ATP. That is the increased metabolism. A side effect that goes along with this is increased body heat. Remember the second law of thermodynamics? If you've forgotten this, go to page 73 in your book. Whenever you convert energy, you get heat. So the more thyroid hormone you have, the more body heat you make. This is why cold weather is a stimulus for increasing your thyroid hormone, because thyroid hormone makes you produce more body heat and keeps you warm in cold weather. Another thing to notice here, enzymes and sodium-potassium pumps. These are both types of protein. Thyroid hormone is stimulating your cells to make protein. Think back to earlier in this chapter. What kind of hormone stimulates cells to make protein? That is lipid soluble. And if you'll recall when we talked about the 3 types of hormones, thyroid hormone is a biogenic amine, which most biogenic amines are water soluble, but it is the exception, it is lipid soluble. So as we go through and look at the other effects of thyroid hormone here, remember that we're going to be stimulating cells to make proteins. Now let's get into the next aspect. The next aspect is providing the fuel for this. We're telling cells to use ATP to make ATP. So if we think about the needs of making ATP, we gave the cells more mitochondrial enzymes, but we have to have the ingredients. So remember, to make ATP, you need fuel, such as glucose or lipid, plus oxygen, and you get ATP. So if we're telling cells to make more ATP, we need to provide the glucose, lipid, and oxygen that cells will need to do that. So the next 2 parts here should be pretty familiar to you. We have the liver. What do you think the liver is going to do? Glycogenolysis. And that will put glucose into the blood. Here's adipose. It'll do lipolysis. And that will put lipid into the blood. So there's our fuels. Now we have the lungs and the heart. They are what's going to supply the additional oxygen to the blood. So your lungs will need to have bronchodilation. So that they can get more oxygen. Your heart will need to beat faster and harder. So that it can send more oxygen. So your heart and lungs are both going to have to increase their work so that you can send more oxygen to your cells so that they can use all those mitochondrial enzymes they have now and make lots of ATP. Think about this for a minute. This should sound familiar. Bronchodilation, heart beating faster and harder. If you need a hint, look back at chapter 15. In fact, this was part of your chapter 15 lab. If you have that handy, take a look at it. You have the answer there. This is what sympathetic stimulation does. So sympathetic stimulation will cause bronchodilation, so you can get more air, and it will cause the heart to increase its rate and force so that you can send more oxygen through the blood. Think back to what you know about sympathetic stimulation. We're going to have norepinephrine bind to beta receptors. So if you want to do this, you can either increase the norepinephrine or you can increase the beta receptors. Start putting pieces together here. You know that thyroid hormone is lipid soluble, so it's going to cause your cells to make protein. You also know that thyroid hormone is going to result in bronchodilation and increased heart rate and force. Which of these, norepinephrine or beta receptors, fits these clues? Which is a protein? Receptors on cells are proteins. Think back to chapter 4. You learned about the cell membrane and that the cell membrane is made of phospholipids, but it has proteins embedded in it. Some of those proteins are receptors. So thyroid hormone causes your heart and lungs to have more beta receptors. Having more beta receptors allows them to bind more norepinephrine. And the more norepinephrine they bind, the more you get bronchodilation and increased rate and force. So it's kind of a roundabout way here. You get thyroid hormone, it goes to your heart and lungs, and it stimulates them to have more beta receptors. Now that they have more beta receptors, they can bind more norepinephrine. That norepinephrine then causes your lungs to dilate so that you can get more oxygen. It causes your heart to beat faster and harder so that it will send more oxygen. Now that you're supplying more oxygen to your cells, they can make more ATP, and because they have more ATP, your metabolism goes up and you make more body heat. Think of all that stuff together. A couple of effects of thyroid hormone. One we just talked about, the making more body heat. That is called the calorogenic effect. This is the fact that you make more body heat. So the whole idea is when you are exposed to cold weather, remember cold weather is a stimulus for your hypothalamus. So the cold weather stimulates your hypothalamus to stimulate your anterior pituitary to secrete more thyroid stimulating hormone, which stimulates your thyroid gland to secrete more thyroid hormone. This extra thyroid hormone then increases your metabolism, and we know from the second law of thermodynamics that when you increase your metabolism, you also increase your heat production. This then keeps you warm in cold weather. Okay. Let's suppose it's October. And we've just come out of a hot summer, in the 90s all the time. And it's October, the weather's starting to cool, the leaves are starting to turn. We get a day when it's 60 degrees. This is the first 60-degree day. How does everybody dress? Everybody's going to be getting out their hoodies. That first 60-degree day in October, you're going to see hoodies everywhere. People are like, oh, it's cold, I got to bundle up. Now let's pretend it's April. We've had a long, cold winter. You get the first 60-degree day in April. How do people respond? They say, oh, it's so warm. I'm going to wear shorts and flip-flops. The same exact temperature. It was 60 degrees both times. In October when it's 60, you bundle up with a hoodie. In April, when it's 60, you go out in shorts and a t-shirt and flip-flops. The difference is your thyroid hormone. In the summer, when it's hot, your thyroid hormone level is low. You make less body heat. In the winter, when it's cold, your thyroid hormone level is high. You make more body heat to keep you warm. Suppose you're living here in Illinois in January and it's really cold, and you get on a plane and you go to Florida and it's 80 degrees there. You're going to think it's really, really hot. Whereas the people there, people in Florida, they don't think 80 is so hot. It's a matter of your thyroid hormone level. Another effect of thyroid hormone is the glucose sparing effect. Remember we talked before when we were talking about insulin that neurons can only use glucose. This means your brain, spine, and nerves rely on glucose. They can't use fat to make ATP. They have to have glucose. So one of the other effects of thyroid hormone is to ensure that you have glucose for your neurons. So you do this two ways. One way is to increase the blood glucose level. You did that with the glycogenolysis of your liver. If there's more glucose in your blood, there you go. Your neurons can get it. The second thing is you also increase your blood lipid. You do this with the lipolysis of your adipose. If there's more lipid, then other cells will take the lipid and that leaves the glucose for your neurons. Just like with growth hormone, how you could have problems of too much or not enough, you get the same thing with thyroid hormone. You can have hypothyroidism, where your thyroid hormone is too low. So think about the symptoms here. Intolerance to cold. Well, yeah, thyroid hormone is what stimulates your metabolism and gives you body heat. So if you have hypothyroidism, you're going to feel cold all the time. You might have weight gain because your metabolism is slowed down. You're going to feel tired all the time. You're going to have fatigue because your cells just can't make enough ATP if your thyroid hormone is too low. So people who have hypothyroidism are probably cold and tired all the time and gaining weight. The other end here, you can have hyperthyroidism. This is where you have too much thyroid hormone. So now you're going to feel hot all the time. Because of that second law of thermodynamics, you're making way too much body heat. You can also experience weight loss. And you're going to be too energetic, kind of jittery. The inability to sit still because you just have too much energy going on here. Some extremes of this. This is a goiter. The thyroid gland is in the neck. So this big lump in her neck is a swollen thyroid. This is due to a lack of iodine in the diet. So your thyroid gland needs iodine in order to make thyroid hormone. So if you lack iodine in the diet, then you can't make thyroid hormone. So you get this cycle. Remember, you have your hypothalamus. It stimulates your anterior pituitary, which secretes THS, thyroid stimulating hormone, which stimulates your thyroid to make thyroid hormone. You have negative feedback. So then your hypothalamus sees that you have thyroid hormone, and then it stops doing this. So it will lay off on the stimulation. Because you're just trying to maintain the right amount of thyroid hormone. When your thyroid gland makes thyroid hormone, you need iodine in order to complete this. If you lack iodine, so if there is no iodine in the diet, then your thyroid gland can't make the thyroid hormone. So there's no thyroid hormone. So your hypothalamus detects a lack of thyroid hormone. So then your hypothalamus is like, what's going on here? We need some thyroid hormone. So it stimulates your anterior pituitary. And it tells it to secrete more TSH, which then goes to your thyroid. Well, if there's no iodine, there's nothing your thyroid can do about it. You still just sit there and not have thyroid hormone. So the lack of thyroid hormone then intensifies this. You get into a positive feedback cycle. Where then the hypothalamus again stimulates the anterior pituitary to secrete more TSH, which stimulates your thyroid. But if there's no iodine, still no thyroid hormone. So now your hypothalamus is like, what's going on? I told you to make some thyroid hormone. So it stimulates again, which then sends more TSH. All this TSH is what makes the thyroid enlarge. So it's this vain effort to get the thyroid gland to make more thyroid hormone by having ever increasing levels of thyroid stimulating hormone. But if there's no iodine, you're not going to get the thyroid hormone. And that's how you end up with a goiter. So when scientists figured this out, came up with this plan to put iodine in salt. That's why we have iodized salt. Since we've started having iodized salt, goiters became very rare. But this is why it's important to buy iodized salt. So when you're at the grocery store and you're looking at the salt and picking which one you should buy, get the iodized. It is possible to buy plain salt. You can buy plain salt. But if you do, you might end up with a goiter. One more extreme is Graves' disease. This is when you have an autoimmune disease. So autoimmune is when your immune system attacks yourself. So you attack your own thyroid gland. And the attack makes the thyroid gland produce too much thyroid hormone. So you get hyperthyroidism. One of the effects of this is it causes swelling of the tissue behind the eyes. And this causes the eyes to bulge out in a condition called exophthalmosis. So the bulging eyes is a key sign of Graves' disease. So here you go. There is thyroid hormone and everything that it does.